I've come to the Senate chamber specifically to speak against President Biden's vaccine mandate. I've pledged before, and I pledge again today, to continue this fight until we beat the mandate. Now, thankfully, progress has been made on this front. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit last week halted enforcement of President Biden's general mandate. They did so directing their ruling specifically to the OSHA portion of the mandate. This is the one that applies to all workers everywhere and in any place of employment with more than 100 workers. I, along with millions of Americans, am grateful that the U.S. court system performed its role in protecting the separation of powers and otherwise protecting the limits on government written into our laws and our Constitution. It's also encouraging to see the government agency charged with enforcing the general mandate, that is OSHA, has now halted the enforcement of the mandate and is complying with the order issued by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. This, however, does not end President Biden's vaccine mandates. That mandate in particular remains the subject of ongoing litigation. And there are other requirements placed on other specific groups of workers outside of the OSHA mandate and therefore outside the scope of the order issued by the Fifth Circuit. Now, I've spoken previously on the situation that members of our armed forces face and on things that people who work in the healthcare profession face. Difficult things, challenging things, things that threaten their livelihoods and cause a lot of problems for workers. I've offered various bills to help those groups of Americans keep their jobs and make sure that they have the right to make their own medical decisions. I'm fighting against the mandate. I'm not fighting against the vaccines. I support the vaccines. I'm vaccinated. I've encouraged others to be vaccinated. I see the development of these vaccines as something of a modern medical miracle, one that's protecting so many millions of Americans from the harms of COVID. But this one-size-fits-all dictate from Washington certainly isn't the answer, and under our system of government can't be. I've heard from hundreds of Utahns who are personally at risk of losing their jobs and their livelihoods due to this mandate. Many of these Utahns have religious or health concerns about the vaccine. President Biden promised these mandates would include exemptions for those people in those categories specifically. But in reality, they're being dismissed or placed on unpaid leave or pushed into retirement with reduced benefits. These are good people, everyday people. Many are dedicated frontline workers. Far too many are just trying to make ends meet and feed their families. It shouldn't be too much to ask to allow them to continue doing that unencumbered by their own government in their efforts to do that. These mandates will just push people out of work and make many of them not only unemployed, but unemployable outcasts in their chosen professions, professions that they've spent years studying and learning, receiving certifications, just in order to work. What a tragedy. This wouldn't just harm those affected directly by the mandates. It absolutely would harm those directly affected by them, but the harm extends much further than those directly affected. It would affect all of us, in fact. The American economy is currently facing a labor shortage, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. Businesses across the country are struggling to find enough workers just to keep their doors open, let alone produce and serve at full efficiency. President Biden's mandate will add to our high unemployment and our low labor force participation rates. And it'll put even more pressure on inflation that's making it harder for Americans everywhere, especially Poor and middle-class Americans, people living paycheck to paycheck, who find that every dollar they earn is buying less of everything from gas to groceries, from housing to health care. Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell recently warned, quote, hiring difficulties and other constraints could continue to limit how quickly supply can adjust, raising the possibility that inflation could turn out to be higher and more persistent than we expect, close quote. The mandate is only worsening the problem. Now, I believe the Biden administration recognizes the harms this mandate will cause for our workforce. It's evident in the administration's date of compliance extension to January 4th that this is the case. Now, I have to ask an obvious question here, or one that I think should be obvious, should be intuitive. If the forced vaccination of our entire federal workforce, including employees and contractors and subcontractors, if forcing the vaccination of every one of these workers were truly an emergency so drastic that all workers, contractors, and subcontractors, even those working remotely in their own homes, must be vaccinated immediately, then why would they risk delaying compliance? They can't have it both ways. If they want to say this is an emergency, this is dire, so dire that we've got to force every contractor, subcontractor, and federal employee to get vaccinated immediately, and we've got to fire them if they don't. If that is truly so emergent, then why delay it to January 4th? Why delay it at all? Now, to be sure, it would be bad, and to be sure, I'm glad they've extended it. Perhaps, maybe this means they're reconsidering this awful, horrible step, this horrible thing that they're inflicting on those who can at least afford to absorb something like this. But it really does undercut the emergent nature of the situation. It undercuts their underlying reasoning that this has to happen immediately. So immediately that we got to fire all of them if they won't submit to presidential medical orthodoxy. This mandate is even so drastic that it includes all workers and all contractors, including all those who work remotely, don't even go into a workplace. And it also includes even those who have natural immunity from a previous case of COVID-19, something that some studies have indicated will provide 27 times the immunity of a vaccine. Again, the vaccines are great. I've been vaccinated. I've encouraged others to do the same. The vaccines are protecting hundreds of millions of Americans right now. But why not take into account their natural immunity? And why on earth would you fire someone who already has natural immunity or who works from home? That makes absolutely no sense. This mandate simply goes far beyond what's reasonable. And it begs all sorts of questions. Why are you doing this? So today, I'm offering a bill to help another group, yet another group of people. It's a group consisting of people not protected by the Fifth Circuit's halting of the general vaccine mandate. Federal workers are still facing a vaccine requirement from the Biden administration. Almost 3 million workers in this country are employed by the federal government. Many of them have reached out to me and my office who are concerned about losing their jobs due to this mandate. I know I'm not the only one. I know that every single member of this body has received phone calls, letters, emails, and other pleas for help from people who don't want to lose their jobs. This is a response to them. This is an effort to try to help them. And part of my ongoing effort to reemphasize the fact that it doesn't have to be this way. My bill the protecting our federal workers, protecting our federal workforce from forced COVID-19 Vaccination Act would prohibit an executive agency from requiring its employees to receive a COVID-19 vaccine. It's a simple solution to prevent more unemployment and to protect countless Americans from being forced out of the workforce. This bill will help protect Americans' right to make their own medical decisions and will help protect our economy as it strains under multiple crises and as the holiday season comes around. I encourage and sincerely implore all of my colleagues to support it. To that end, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 3243, which is at the desk. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, in an ideal world, we would not need a vaccine mandate. In the ideal world, the vast majority of people who can get vaccinated would heed the advice of scientists and of public health officials and take the very simple step to get vaccinated so that we can get this pandemic under control. But unfortunately, our reality is very different. We have been working to contain this virus and manage this unprecedented health crisis for nearly 2 years now. It has cost us more than 765,000 American lives and millions of other Americans who have been infected and may face lifelong health challenges as a result. It doesn't have to be this way. We have safe, effective, and life-saving vaccines that are now thankfully available to a significant number of Americans. Vaccines are our best tool to finally get this pandemic under control, and requiring the folks who are able to get vaccinated is just simply common sense. We're all tired of this pandemic, and we all want it to end. We're tired of wearing masks because some folks refuse to get vaccinated. We're tired of wondering if we could unknowingly be exposing our vulnerable family members who are taking every precaution. We're tired of waiting for enough people to get vaccinated so that our schools, that our businesses, and our daily lives can just get back to normal. And we're tired of emergency rooms and healthcare workers getting overrun by COVID cases from people who are not vaccinated when we already have the best tool to prevent the spread in the first place. Our frontline healthcare workers are being crushed by the consistently high number of cases, and public health experts are predicting yet another spike will likely hit this winter unless people get vaccinated. In my home state of Michigan, the number of unvaccinated patients hospitalized with COVID is once again climbing. A headline from today noted Michigan has just reached a new pandemic record with the highest COVID case average in the nation, and that deaths across the state continue to rise. Emergency rooms are packed, and in some areas, patients are forced to wait for hours or for days to be admitted. There is one key factor that's driving this horrific scenario. 88% of the cases, 88% of the hospitalizations, and 88% of the tragic deaths were all people who were unvaccinated. We can put an end to this nightmare by getting more Americans vaccinated. You know, we require so many preventative measures to keep ourselves and others safe. We wear seatbelts in our cars. We require hard hats on construction sites. We get vaccinated to protect ourselves against a whole number of health risks. And we do it because we know it saves lives and it keeps people healthy. The answer is simple. Get vaccinated. Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho, Utah.
Mr. President, I appreciate the thoughtful remarks and the insights of my friend and distinguished colleague, the senator from Michigan. He's someone with whom I enjoy working, and one of the many things I appreciate about him is that he puts a lot of thought into everything he does. I've always found him to be considerate, and I appreciate that about him. I also am in agreement with the fact that in an ideal world, people would be getting vaccinated more than they are. And in that world, if more people got vaccinated, I do think there would be fewer hospitalizations, fewer deaths, fewer COVID infections. And there are a lot of data sources supporting that. I also agree that, we're all tired as a country, as individuals, as families, regardless of what state we live in. We're tired of the pandemic, of the ERs being overcrowded and things like that. These are all things we want to do away with. And I also agree with my colleague from Michigan. Those things really would be alleviated if more people got vaccinated. In my mind, the question that we're discussing here isn't about a disagreement over the objectives we've got. It's more about how to get there, who has authority to take what action, and what consequences might attach to government actions. Notwithstanding the fact that my friend from Michigan and I both agree that the American people, to the extent they've been vaccinated, are benefiting as a whole from being vaccinated, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree. It doesn't get rid of disagreements that exist, in some cases because of our religious belief or another moral conviction, one that I don't happen to share, and probably most of us in this body don't happen to share, but that some people have. There are some people who, for religious or moral reasons, believe that they shouldn't be vaccinated. There are others who have a specific medical condition that has involved receiving medical advice from board-certified medical doctors that someone shouldn't get this particular vaccine. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, I don't purport to understand these things, but I do know what I hear from Utahns, which is that a number of them have cited medical conditions of one sort or another, previous personal or family medical history that has signaled particular sensitivity to vaccines in general, or in some cases, when people have autoimmune conditions of one sort or another, or a combination of them. In some cases, doctors are concerned about inflaming that condition, inflaming the immune system of particular patients, and on that basis, advise their patients with particular, somewhat unusual medical histories not to be vaccinated. There are others still who might not fit into either of these categories, but might consist of people who have already had the coronavirus and have recovered from it at some point over the last 18 months. There are studies indicating that natural immunity is real, and that have suggested that natural immunity can convey comparable immunity to that available under the vaccine. Some of the studies have indicated that that immunity could not only be as strong as, but in some cases 27 times stronger than, that conferred by the vaccine. I have both. I had the coronavirus over a year ago, and I still chose to be vaccinated in addition to that. My own experience with the coronavirus wasn't all that pleasant. It wasn't an experience that I care to relive. And in consultation with my doctor, I concluded that it was a good thing for me to get it. I was willing to get it, especially upon learning that it might help protect me even further if I also had the vaccine, in addition to having natural immunity. But, not everybody is going to reach the same conclusions. And one of the struggles that we've had as a country involves difficult questions that people face when they disagree, when they have a genuine disagreement. We've got to be careful about how we use government power, because government power necessarily involves the use of force. Most of the time, mercifully, it doesn't have to involve the direct, actual use of force. It can involve the implicit or implied or future or prospective use of force. In other words, you comply with this or that law or regulation or government dictate of one sort or another, then you're fine. If you don't, you know that at some point there will be consequences. A lot of people comply voluntarily after they've received a notice from a law enforcement officer or agent, or maybe they wait until someone has sued them and then they get a court order. But they know that at some point, if they refuse to comply, the government can enforce what it's requiring. So whenever we involve government in these kinds of decisions, we have to be able to defend the actual or threatened or potential use of force in order to justify what we're doing. And we have to ask, is this moral? Is this an appropriate case to use violence? Because if it's not an appropriate case to use violence for something, there's kind of a problem with putting government into the equation. Because ultimately you have to rely on government to be willing to threaten violence and carry out violence, meaning to show up to somebody's house with a summons, an arrest warrant or something like that, and take them away. All that involves force. And again, mercifully, most of the time it doesn't have to come to that. Most of the time, Americans, comply with the law just because it's a good thing to comply with the law. But we really should ask the question whether a government action is morally justified in any circumstance to such a degree that the use of violence would be warranted if it came to that. I struggle to accept the proposition that it's okay to use violence to force someone to get a COVID-19 vaccine. As much as I love the fact that the vaccines are available and are a real blessing, something of a modern medical miracle, I can't get comfortable with the idea of using violence to force people who have another opinion to comply. It seems morally problematic and morally unjustified, for that matter, indefensible, for the government to tell someone, if you don't get this shot, you will get fired. And in fact, to tell their employer, you must fire this person if this person doesn't get the vaccine, even if this person has a good faith religious belief against it, even if this person has natural immunity or has some particular medical condition causing his or her board-certified medical doctor to advise against receiving the jab. That isn't moral. To say to that person, you didn't comply with a presidential medical edict, so you're fired. And to tell the employer, if you don't fire that person, you're going to be the subject of punitive fines that will cripple any business. And I literally mean any business. I don't think there is a business in America subject to these mandates that could survive the crippling, deliberately cruel fines that are levied under them. Not a one. This isn't right. It's not moral. Deep down, we know it. In fact, according to a recent poll, a poll conducted and reported by Axios, hardly a right-wing publication. It involved a question, and the poll question was something along the lines of, should a person who declines to be vaccinated be fired for not being vaccinated? 14% agreed that that's okay. 14%, only 14 out of 100 Americans said, yeah, that makes sense. That's okay. Fire the sucker. Fire him. Fire her. They don't matter. It's compounded when you look at the tragedies imposed by the individual circumstances, the soldier, the sailor, the airman, the Marine, the TSA worker, the federal contractor, the employee of a subcontractor of a company with one federal contract does mostly non-federal work. The mom, the dad working in a factory, in a school, in a floral shop. If any of those either have a federal contract or have more than 99 employees, all those people are having their livelihoods threatened. It's not just a job, it's in many cases, as is the case in the healthcare industry, for example, people who have spent a lifetime acquiring the skills, the professional certifications, the degrees, the training, the education necessary in order to participate in that profession. Many of these people, by the way, throughout the pandemic, the darkest hours of the pandemic, were the people working hardest to protect Americans, to make sure that they had access to the health care they needed. Those same people are now being told, oh, you're not good enough, you don't deserve a job, you're going to be fired. Even if you've got a medical condition that precludes it. Even if this could be morally justified, which it can't, one must ask the question, a question asked by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Does Congress, does the federal government have the power to order such a widespread vaccine mandate? It doesn't. The OSHA mandate, for example. Constitutionally, it'd have to be predicated on Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause, which gives us the power to regulate trade or commerce between the states with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. Even as that provision of the Constitution has been interpreted really broadly since 1937, even under that broad interpretation, one that has seen only 3 acts of Congress over the last 84 years being deemed outside of Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause. I mean, you have to almost try hard to pass legislation predicated on Commerce Clause authority that doesn't fall within it. But even under that, this doesn't pass the test. It's not, by its nature, economic activity. In fact, it's not activity. You're punishing non-activity. So even under these high watermark precedents from the New Deal era, establishing a very deferential standard of review for exercises of Commerce Clause authority by Congress, this doesn't even pass that. And even if it did, which it doesn't, you'd still have to identify, in the case of the OSHA mandate, a definable delegation of authority from Congress using some intelligible principle authorizing this kind of action. You will not find that. It's not there. I've reviewed upside down, sideways, backwards, forwards, the statutory text at issue with regard to OSHA. It does not provide this authority. The moral authority is lacking. The constitutional authority is lacking. There is no power delegated by the Congress to OSHA to do this. It's not defensible. Now, look, I'm glad that delays on some of these mandates have been imposed. I'm glad that OSHA is at least agreeing to comply with the order of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and at least for the duration of that litigation, enforcement will be halted. I hope and I fully expect that the ultimate resolution of that case will be consistent with what the Fifth Circuit ruled last week. In fact, I have little doubt that it will be. This is in some ways the most brazen act of presidential overreach that we've seen in a single directive since President Harry Truman on April 8th, 1952, issued an order seizing every steel mill in the United States for steel production related to the Korean War effort. Mercifully, the Supreme Court of the United States was able to intervene and within a couple of months invalidated that action. This one is even clearer than that. But more importantly, Mr. President, this one is more emotionally compelling than that. That unconstitutional act of presidential overreach affected a handful of steel companies. It certainly affected, thousands upon thousands of workers. But it didn't have the ability to affect directly or indirectly every single man, woman, and child in America. This one does. That's one of the reasons why these moral and statutory and constitutional questions matter so much. That's why I've been coming to the floor every day and why I will continue doing so indefinitely as long as it takes.
Let me tell you a story of an individual that works in the eastern part of my state, who works for one of those companies that's 100 people or more. He didn't want to have the vaccine. The reason's not even important. But he said he didn't want to take the vaccine. So what happened in his company of 100 or more? They fired him a couple of weeks ago. You're welcome, Mr. President. Thanks for firing him. Oh, it gets better. He lost his house because he couldn't pay the mortgage, and this adult man has now moved in with his family while he tries to figure out what happens next for him. You know why? Because the president said he was losing patience, and he didn't care if this guy lost his house, lost his job, lost his insurance. The president was just saying, go get it, or else. Well, thanks. Right before Thanksgiving, he's experiencing the or else. One of my constituents' husband is facing termination. He's from another one of those large companies. He's worked for them for 30 years. He has secret clearance from the DOD, and his doctor gave him an exemption because his cardiac numbers fluctuate so much, and he is one of those high-risk individuals for blood clots, which can be a side effect of the vaccines. So his doctor has encouraged him not to take the vaccine. So he went into his job, he asked for the exemption, the medical exemption, and he was given 2 forms to sign. The first of the forms said he had to agree to take the vaccination or he would lose his job. The second form agreed that if he took the vaccination, he would not sue the company if he had a negative reaction. So here's a man who has to choose between taking the vaccine, knowing that his doctor has told him not to do it, and if he does take it, if he has a negative reaction, the company wants to be held harmless for it, and he's got to sign a document saying the company will be held harmless for it, or lose his job. Do you know why? Because President Biden said he was losing patience. So this family gets to sit around over Thanksgiving not talking about football, but talking about whether he's going to lose his job or possibly have a blood clot in the hospital. Which would you like to have that conversation on over Thanksgiving? There's a company that does electrical engineering that also has one of those federal contracts they talk about. Though some of the employees don't do the federal contracting, they work for other issues. 50 people of the 250 in the company have said they don't want to take the vaccine, and so they're in the process of losing their jobs. And that company will not be able to fulfill its federal contract because hiring 50 more electricians is not that simple right now with the economy that we're currently in. A constituent told us that her employer is going to lay her off on December the 8th because she hasn't had the vaccine yet. So she will spend Thanksgiving discussing this with her family as she approaches the time where she's about to be laid off. She works in one of those companies that has a federal contract. She reached out to her primary care doctor, who is at the VA, by the way, and the VA instructed her that they're not writing exemptions for medical exemptions. She's on her own. Why? Because the president's losing patience, and he's decided he's going to throw all of these families in chaos, or they're going to lose their job because he said so. Why have I been fighting this mandate since September the 9th when the president actually announced it? Because it was obvious to me what was coming. It was this. Everyone could see it, apparently, but the White House. Americans are stubborn people. That's what's made us the most prosperous, freest people in the world. We're entrepreneurs. We take risks. We understand the consequences for our risk, but we also go do because we can. We're Americans. And now the President of the United States has announced, I don't care. You're going to get this or else. So what's the real effect of this? All of this chaos? Oh, this is just part of it. There's a whole lot more. How about the EMS folks that are in rural Oklahoma that are having a hard time actually keeping some of their drivers and folks in because they've chosen not to take the vaccine? What happens in 3 weeks from now when people get sick at their house or have a heart attack and EMS can't respond because those folks got fired from their jobs because the president said, I'm losing patients? What happens? I'll tell you what happens. People will die. Other families are going to struggle through this process as they're figuring out where they're going to work because they've lost their career because the president said, I've lost patience with you. Tell me this. For the person that's the JAG officer in the military, works in the National Guard, and for whatever reason, whether it's a religious accommodation, medical accommodation, whatever it may be, they choose not to take this vaccine. When they get a dishonorable discharge, what happens to them? They lose their law license, is what happens to them. They're disbarred, and they're no longer practicing their profession. What happens to the state trooper in Oklahoma that also serves on our National Guard? When they get dishonorably discharged, they don't just lose their military career, they lose their civilian career. What happens to the nurse or the doctor that serves with the National Guard? When they get drummed out, what happens? They lose their military career and their civilian career. That's what happens. Do you know why? Because the president decided he was losing patience with the American people, and they have to do what he says to do, not what they want to do. That's why all this chaos is happening. I heard from a constituent, 28 years of federal service. 28 years of federal service. I'm not going to give the administration that they work in, but they work behind the scenes in an exceptionally important, exceptionally difficult task, serving their neighbors as a federal employee. She doesn't want to retire, but she doesn't want to take this vaccine either. So you know what she's doing? She's retiring. And what's going to happen in this agency in Oklahoma when they lose this cornerstone person at this agency? They will struggle to figure out what she did, how she did it. And people in Oklahoma will get less help in that agency because a long-term, vital civil servant is about to get run out of civil servants because President Biden decided he lost patience with her. That wasn't in her civil service contract. That was never negotiated with any of the collective bargaining rights agreements. Never. There is no addition in any collective bargaining rights agreements for federal employees that they have to get a vaccine mandate if the president decides that they do. But he decided, that is, President Biden decided, that he was going to take this on. And so she is going to be discussing over Thanksgiving what she's going to do post-retirement, wishing that she could stay a little longer to be able to build up a few more years, and thought she was going to be able to, but instead she got ran out because she and the president had a difference of opinion about a brand new vaccine. Now, I've said to this group before several times, and I'll say it again. I've had the vaccine. I encourage others to take the vaccine. 80% of Americans who are 12 years old or older have had the vaccine. There are plenty of Americans that have had the vaccine, that support the vaccine, but do not want their next door neighbor to get fired because they disagree on the vaccine. In fact, I don't know a lot of people that do, though I've met some that are just that heartless to be able to say, I don't care what you think, I want to feel better, forcing you to go get the vaccine. I've met some of those folks, but I don't meet many of them. Most of them say, I freely made the decision. They should be able to freely make the decision as well. But apparently that's not where the president is, and unfortunately, that's not where some of my Democratic colleagues are. Because multiple times we have brought an end to the vaccine mandates to multiple committees in multiple places over the last several months, and it gets knocked down every time. Just this week, we filed a Congressional Review Act dealing with just the OSHA piece. We've got another one coming dealing with all of those on CMS. To make a simple statement, we have got to stop this vaccine mandate. It is causing chaos in our families. It is causing chaos in our economy. And anyone who doesn't think it is not talking to people at home. So we'll bring this in the next 18 days to the floor of this Senate. And we will force a vote to it and put everyone on record. Do you stand with the American people that strongly affirm the vaccine, but strongly oppose the mandate? Or will you be one to say, don't care, I stand with the president. I'm losing patience with people, this 20% that haven't done the vaccine. I'm losing patience with them, and I'm just going to force them to do it as well. Because that decision is coming to every single person in this body. This could be turned off right now. And it already, one section of it already is turned off. The Fifth Circuit Court reached in on the issue of private employers and said that this was way overly broad of the president. No kidding. That it was unconstitutional for the president to reach into companies and to say, I don't care who it is, how important they are to the company, if you don't make them do the vaccine, you have to fire them. The Fifth Circuit said you cannot do that. Thank you, Fifth Circuit, for finally joining in on that. OSHA has now said they're not going to enforce that. But there's lots of other companies that have done it anyway. And I would tell you, for this individual in eastern Oklahoma that's already been fired and lost his house, it's too late for him for suddenly the Biden team to say, just kidding, we're going to pull that back. His life's already been wrecked by you. What else is happening? Well, I've reached out to multiple different agencies to be able to talk this through, and it's been fascinating to me when I talk to federal agencies. By the way, the federal agency mandate for all federal employees is next week to be able to have it done. But when I talk to leaders of agencies of multiple different departments across this town, none of them seem to know how many of their employees have actually been vaccinated yet. None of them. They all say, well, we think it's quite a few. And I'll say, how many folks have not been vaccinated? Well, we have an X number that have reported to us, but they don't seem to know. It's become so chaotic that the federal workers, their unions, have finally stepped in. Finally. I've been shocked how slow the federal unions were to this. They finally stepped up and asked for an extension of the president to say, don't put the mandate down for next week. Give people more time. because literally people are sitting around over Thanksgiving deciding whether they're going to keep their job or not. And if 10 to 20% of the workforce across the federal workforce leaves, we're in such chaos that there's no way we'll be able to finish serving people as we desperately need to be able to do across the federal government. So what would I recommend? Well, I had some very frank conversations with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. It's interesting to me when I visit with the EEOC, that's the group that helps protect workers, whether they're federal workers or private sector workers, from discrimination, protects workers from inappropriate termination. When I talk to the EEOC, what I hear from them is they weren't consulted through the process of developing this new vaccine mandate and all the exemptions that should be in place. So can I just tell the workers of my state and the workers across the country a simple thing? If your employer will not accept your religious accommodation that you put in, or your medical exemption that you put in, if they do not accept those, you need to go to the EEOC and file a complaint, because the EEOC has rules about termination that are inappropriate termination. And if individuals are being terminated from private companies, even if they're federal contractors or if they're federal employees, I encourage you to go to the EEOC and file a complaint if they're not hearing your medical accommodation or your religious accommodation. That is your right as an American. And when the President of the United States is running over your rights, you have every right to be able to appeal that personally. You don't have to hire an attorney. You can file that complaint on your own to be able to make sure that your employer knows that you're filing an EEOC complaint against them for inappropriate termination for not accepting your medical exemption and your religious accommodation. Interestingly enough, when I approached the Office of Management and Budget a month ago about how they're going to handle religious accommodation, they said it is not the business of federal workers to decide individuals' faith. We're just going to accept that. But when the document came out, there is a 6-part test whether you are religious enough to be able to turn down the vaccine. They literally create a 6-part test that every supervisor can go through and check to determine if you're religious enough to be able to turn this down. This would be the first time that I know of that the federal government has actually reached into an entity, to individuals, and said, we're going to decide for you how religious you are. That's how crazy this has become. I encourage you again, if individuals have said you're not religious enough to be able to ask for this accommodation, go to the EEOC, file a complaint against your employer, whether that be a federal agency, whether it be a private entity, and make sure that they're well aware of what's going on. Now, if you work in a federal agency, you've got an initial appeals process that actually goes through. Go through that process. But if you're denied or not heard, you do have rights as an American. And I would encourage you to be able to stand up for your rights as an American against unjust hiring and unjust firing in this process. Let me read this last letter to you. As we have fought through this process and to find every leverage point I can find for the people in my state to be able to make their own decisions, it has been difficult to be able to talk to people in the struggles that they have. Let me read one. This gentleman wrote to me, I retired after 20 years of active duty service in the military to enjoy time with my family and the supreme blessings of freedom and peace our country has secured at the expense beyond human measure. Now, many of our undaunted service members and veterans alike face possible unemployment because we refuse to take a vaccine. Some are being coerced into taking it because they can't support their families while unemployed. The very people who risk their lives and the well-being of their children face persecution for a personal medical choice. His comment to me, this is not American. I agree. That's why we're fighting this. That's why we'll continue to be able to push this. That's why we're bringing a Congressional Review Act up to put every single person in this body on record. Do you support forcing people to take a vaccine or be fired or not? I do not. And I hope 99 other of my colleagues also do not. I yield the floor.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.